Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Gwen Koch, and I manage the Food Literacy Project through Harvard University Dining Services. And we're very excited to have our guest presenter this afternoon, Micah Kaats, who's going to be talking about shared meals and well-being. Mika is himself a public policy student at the Harvard Kennedy School and wears many hats in terms of research topics that he'll be sharing more about today. I also want to mention that there's an opportunity to have a special dinner together with Mika as well as Dean Dunn, among some other folks, at the end of this presentation at Annenberg Dining Hall. It'll be a lottery, so we're going to pass around slips where you can put your name and your email. We'll do a drawing, and then 10 attendees will get to attend this dinner at Annenberg starting at 5:30. So we will go ahead and begin with Mika. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here. My name is Micah Kaats. I'm a PhD in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And mostly what my research focuses on is happiness and well-being. So I get a lot of questions about sort of what's the secret to happiness. And I'm going to give it to you today. You've come to the right place. I have an answer for you. No, I don't have an answer for you, but it's a question that has been bothering philosophers for thousands of years and academic happiness researchers for at least a few decades. And one happiness researcher came up with an idea for how to actually summarize the entire field of happiness research in 3 words, Dr. Christopher Peterson. And what he said to summarize happiness research in 3 words was make more money. No, I'm kidding. That's not what he said. What he really said was other people matter. And I've been doing this now for a few years, and as far as I can tell, that's probably the best and most succinct description of the field of happiness and well-being research that I've come across so far. Just really the importance of social connections pops up almost anywhere you look. So there's a bunch of examples of this in the research. I'll just talk about a few. One is here at Harvard. One of the oldest studies, not just of well-being, I think like in social science in general, is the Harvard study of adult development. They've been tracking Harvard graduates for about 80 years. I think one of them became president. I don't know which president, but they've been following them for a very long time, trying to see different factors as they progress over the life course. And it's now being run by Dr. Robert Waldinger, who just wrote a book, a very good book. He's been making the rounds recently on the media. And I think what he would say, and I hope I'm doing justice, is that the key takeaway from the study is really the importance of social connections. So I pulled some quotes here that says, the surprising finding is that our relationships and how happy we are in our relationships has a powerful influence on our health. And the benefit of this study is you can look at this longitudinally, right? So the people who were most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 were also the healthiest at age 80. And while I was on the Harvard Gazette website looking for this story, I found another story just that was published yesterday by another colleague of mine, I guess I can say at Harvard, Dr. Danny Gilbert, who gave a talk as well recently where he cited work from Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton, who also showed in a 2010 study that the mood boost from spending a day with loved ones was 7 times larger than the boost from quadrupling annual income. And finally, sort of the reverse of social connections, or loneliness, also has been a lot in the news in the last couple of years and can have really devastating consequences on health. This is from a Surgeon General's report in 2023, which cited some earlier research showing that the lack of social connection actually is associated with as negative health risks as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So overall, I think just to briefly summarize, social connections are really, really important for individuals. And there's, again, those are just some highlights, but this has been shown over and over again in the research that people who are more socially connected have longer lifespans, have better health outcomes, lower levels of depression, higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness, more financially secure, more professionally successful, more trusting and cooperative. And this relationship also appears to be bidirectional. So happier people are more likely to be social in general, and being social also tends to make people happier. So there's a sort of virtuous cycle that we also see. And again, the reverse, loneliness and isolation, can have really devastating consequences for human health. And I think we're sort of just kind of at the frontier of this research even still. I think it's going to become increasingly important. But also, social connections matter not just for individuals, but also for society. So on sort of a higher level, socially connected societies also tend to be more prosperous. They tend to be more stable, greater interpersonal trust. There's greater faith in institutions. And also, we see higher levels of altruism. So there's more charitable giving, there's more volunteering. And again, this relationship appears to be bidirectional, where more socially connected societies produce better outcomes, but also more stable and prosperous societies produce greater social cohesion. Social cohesion leads to more prosperity. And I also just want to make a point, I study public policy, sort of how we can advise governments on how to improve societal welfare. And it's my sense that I think promoting social connections is actually becoming an increasingly important lever of policy. And that's particularly true in high-income countries where we see rising levels of isolation and loneliness, and also perhaps reaching the happiness limits of economic growth. Now, that last statement is pretty controversial as a former economist, so I want to actually kind of unpack that a little bit and show one of my favorite graphs. This is global GDP over the long run. So this is the wealth of the world measured from year 0 until the present day. And it actually is sort of measured from year 0. They look into crop yields and trading logs and all kinds of things going back thousands of years. And obviously, the key takeaway is that we've shot up in our wealth in recent years. This is for a lot of reasons, but government policy, public policy has played a really important role in that. Governments do tend to focus on economic growth, and we've seen pretty extraordinary benefits. And now if we look at a graph of global happiness over the same period for the last 2,000 years, no, I'm just kidding. We don't have a graph of global happiness for 2,000 years. We really have only started measuring happiness in terms of asking people how they feel about their lives. Are they satisfied with their lives? Their emotions, really only in the last 70 or 80 years or so. And what one of the first researchers, Richard Easterlin, did when this data started to become available was just kind of plot increases in economic growth alongside average levels of happiness over time. And he produced graphs that sort of look like this, where here you see the line that indicates economic growth over time, increasing incomes per capita, and then average levels of happiness of the population in the United States. And so you can see that as GDP is increasing, actual average levels of well-being have kind of remained constant. That pissed a lot of economists off and jump-started an entire field of happiness research that now I sort of am trying to be involved in. And it's called the Easterlin paradox. And there's been a lot of research on this that I won't spend too much time on, but it's also worth noting that we see something similar going on at an individual level. So there before I was showing you average levels of income and average levels of happiness at a higher country level. Here now we can also look at individuals, and here on the x-axis you see sort of average income, and then on the y-axis average life satisfaction, and you see this sort of relationship of diminishing marginal returns. What that really means is that kind of at lower levels of income, gains in happiness produced by additional gains in income are really important. So if you make $10,000 a year, making $20,000 a year is going to make a really big difference to your happiness. But at higher levels of income, and especially even further off this graph, if you're making $500,000 a year, $510,000 a year is not really going to make that much of a difference. So we see this kind of diminishing marginal returns with income. And I have a little bit of time to talk today. I don't always get to do this, but I want to dive into this a little deeper, because if any of you are paying attention, you may have seen some headlines recently saying, actually, money does buy happiness. Happiness does increase at higher levels of income. There was a study by Matt Killingsworth, and then more recently with Matt Killingsworth and Danny Kahneman on this issue. And what all the headlines said was that actually money does buy happiness. And it continues to go up. The more money that you make, it sort of look like this, where you see household income, again, on the x-axis, and you see different ways of measuring well-being on the y-axis, and this continuing relationship, even past a threshold of $70,000, which in previous research was shown to be the threshold past which income stops mattering so much for happiness. And that made all the rounds, and I got a lot of questions about this, and I still sort of do. There's something that really bothers me about this graph, and it is the x-axis here. So these are kind of small numbers. I don't know if anybody can really see them, but let's zoom in. This is not a linear axis. This is a doubling of income, right? So we're going from $15,000 a year to $30,000 to $60,000 to $120,000 to $240,000 to $480,000. So now if we go back, okay, well, so yeah, maybe happiness does actually increase even at higher levels of income, but it takes so much more income to produce the same amount of increase in happiness once you get to higher levels. So some colleagues of mine at the Happier Lives Institute recreated this graph with linear x-axis, and here you see again the same relationship. So why does this matter? Why have I just spent the whole time talking to you about this? So again, I study public policy. I'm interested in how governments can improve people's well-being, can improve societal welfare. And one of the main focuses of government policy, for very good reason, and for the last 100, 200, 300 years, has been to try to improve the wealth of nations to improve economic growth. But if economic growth is producing diminishing marginal returns in terms of well-being, then maybe we should try to look elsewhere in terms of how to try to improve the well-being of citizens and societies. And I like to think about this in terms of the care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of good government, which is made up of Jefferson. But I do agree with it. I do think that it's really important, and I think if we're going to try to think about how to actually improve individual and societal welfare, then it's worth trying to think about some other ways of doing that. So to briefly summarize so far, we've seen that social connections are critically important for both individual well-being and for societal welfare. Also that loneliness and isolation can have devastating consequences and appear to be increasing in high-income countries. Wealth and income seem to have diminishing marginal returns, and therefore promoting social connections could improve health and well-being, help to strengthen communities, and improve societal bonds. Promoting social connections. That brings me to the point of the talk today, sharing meals. So here I'm going to summarize some research looking at links between sharing meals, dining alone, and subjective well-being. This is research that my colleagues and I, Jan de Neve at the University of Oxford, Andrew Dugan at Gallup, and Alberto Prati at UCL, published in this year's edition of the World Happiness Report. And we kind of focused on 5 key questions that we wanted to try to answer. So the first is, are there global differences in how often people share meals? If there are, then what explains them? What accounts for them? How important is sharing meals for well-being? Is meal sharing related to other measures of social connectedness? And how have rates of meal sharing changed over time? And to give a brief motivation for why we're doing this research in the first place, there's been some research, and particularly among adolescents and in families, showing that meal sharing can have a range of positive social benefits in terms of sort of later life outcomes, health outcomes, et cetera. But it's really kind of focused in small or specific case studies, not at a sort of broader scale. And also, the relationship overall between sharing meals, well-being, and social connections has remained relatively unexplored. What I really like about this particular topic is that this measure of social connectedness, sharing meals, is relatively objective. So this is a question that I get always, and it's a really good question, of if you're thinking about happiness or you're thinking about well-being, how can you actually compare that across people, right? How happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Who's to say that your 7 is the same as somebody else's 7? How can we make these comparisons? It's a really good point. That's a topic for another lecture. But what's really nice about this measure of sharing meals is that it's much more objective, right? If I ask you how happy you are and ask someone else, that might be hard to compare. If I ask you how many meals did you eat with somebody yesterday, and I ask somebody else, that's really comparable. So that's really nice, because if it does prove to be a strong indicator of well-being or a strong indicator of social connections, then we can make pretty reliable comparisons across countries, cultures, between individuals, and over time. And this is kind of one of the few metrics that we actually have like this in happiness research. There's another really famous one of sort of lost wallets, where they first in surveys asked people, what do you think the chances are if you dropped your wallet in the street, if it would get returned to you? And that proved to be a really important indicator of social capital across societies. And then more recently, I think 3 or 4 years ago, they actually ran that study. Got massive funding for it, went all around the world and actually dropped wallets in the street and saw how many of those were returned. And turns out the surveys actually did map on to the real world experiments, and again, were really important indicators of social connection and social capital. But I'm just sort of personally attracted to these objective measures of people's subjective feelings and social connections. So the data that I'm going to be showing a lot of results for here come from 2 different sources. And in fact, I really would like to say that the motivation for doing this chapter was the very high-minded idea of we want to sort of promote social connections by researching sharing meals, which was partly true. But the real reason is that we got some new data in that we had never had before that actually allowed us to do this research. So in 2022 and 2023, the Gallup World Poll, which is an incredibly impressive endeavor, every year they go around asking a representative sample in over 140 countries about a large list of questions on surveys. And they recently introduced these two questions from Ajinomoto, I think, sponsored it, a Japanese company, on how many days did you eat lunch with someone you know in the past week, and on how many days did you eat dinner with someone you know. Those two questions, as I'm going to show you, are really, really interesting and important indicators of social connections around the world, as it turns out. But because this data is relatively new, we also wanted to take a look to see if we could figure out how meal sharing has changed, if it has changed over time. And so for that, we're going to turn to a case study of the United States using the American Time Use Survey, which is sort of one of the best, most reliable time use data sets in the world. It's been going on for a little over 20 years, and it's having its funding being threatened, by the way, so just a side note. But it's really, really important and really valuable. And since 2003, representative samples of about 12,000 Americans per year have been asked to fill out daily diaries regarding their time use, their activities, and their social environments, leading to a sample of around 235,000 people. And also really interesting for our purposes is in a few years that the survey was run, in 2010, 2012, 2013, and 2021, respondents were also asked to report how they feel during various activities that were randomly selected throughout the day. So using this, we're also able to look back in time to see how meal sharing has evolved longitudinally, at least in the United States. And so I'm going to be focusing on two primary indicators of meal sharing. One is just sharing meals, the number of meals shared with others. In Gallup, that data is asked, the survey questions asked in terms of the last week. And in the American Time Use Survey, asked in the previous day. And then also we're going to generate this measure of dining alone, which is eating all meals alone in the last week in the Gallup data, or eating all meals alone in the previous day in the American Time Use Survey. So these two measures I'm going to be focusing on a lot, sharing meals and dining alone. And we also consider numerous indicators of well-being and social connectedness. I'm going to say well-being a lot. There are different ways of thinking about well-being. What I generally mean, and what others in the field generally mean when they talk about well-being, is how you feel about and throughout your life. So how you feel about your life as a whole. Are you satisfied with your life? Do you have meaning in your life? Do you have social connections? And also how you feel throughout your life. So your emotions, your moods. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you stressed? Are you excited? And that's what we call kind of positive affect and negative affect. I like the term well-being a little bit more than happiness because I think happiness refers to like a particular type of positive affect. You feel happy on a day-to-day basis. Well-being is sort of the more holistic concept for how you feel about your life overall and how you experience life on a day-to-day basis in terms of your emotions and your moods. And we're also going to be looking at a few other measures of social connectedness and social capital, like trust, reciprocity, volunteering, donations, altruism, loneliness, and social support. So with that in mind, there's 4 sections that I'm going to go through and talk about today. The first is sharing meals around the world, then the relationship between sharing meals and well-being. Then we're going to look specifically at the US, look at sharing meals over time, and then finally consider the relationship between sharing meals and other measures of social connectedness. But we'll start with sharing meals around the world. So one of the first things, one of the easiest analyses to run, but also one of the most interesting, was just to plot average levels of meal sharing around the world. You might imagine, well, there's probably not that much difference between how often people eat with each other in different countries or in different regions. And we found exactly the opposite. There are actually big differences around the world in terms of how often people eat meals with each other and how often they don't. So here you're seeing a graph of the average number of meals shared per week. Again, we're thinking of lunches and dinners across various regions. You see Latin America and Caribbean countries are sort of all the way at the top. Latin American countries in general often kind of punch above their weight in terms of happiness and well-being based on what you might imagine, given their levels of economic growth and so forth. And I think a lot of that has to do with the high level of social capital and social connections in a lot of Latin American countries. English-speaking countries more likely to share dinners, as we might be after the talk, than lunches, but also really low levels of meal sharing in East Asia and South Asian countries. And we don't really, I mean, again, this is sort of the first time that we've had global data on meal sharing like this, so it's really the very beginning of this, and this will be a theme throughout the talk. We don't really know why a lot of these things are happening, and I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for future research. But just the fact that we do see this global variation is really, really interesting. On a country level, so now here you're seeing kind of a color map of meal sharing across different countries. And you see sort of just similar wide variation, right? Senegal tops the list of the most meals shared, I think something like 10 to 11, followed per week, followed by Gambia, Malaysia, and Paraguay. Iceland is the only English-speaking country in the top 10 sharing meals. Canada's 53rd, the US is 69th, so kind of right in the middle of the pack in terms of meal sharing. And then India, Bangladesh, and Estonia are all the way at the bottom of the list. One thing you might notice, even just from that sort of handful of countries, is that it's hard to figure out what explains that, right? I mean, you might imagine income. You would think, okay, well, maybe in poorer countries, people would be more likely to share meals together. And so you would expect that poorer countries would share more meals than richer countries more likely to eat alone. On the other hand, you might imagine that people in richer countries have more money to go out to dinners or host dinner parties. Maybe they have more meals shared with each other. And I, again, don't really know what the answer is, but it doesn't seem to be explained exclusively by income. So we do see kind of a moderate correlation between income and meal sharing. But overall, income differences only explain less than 5% of global variation in meal sharing. And I think this is kind of a big open question of what actually explains these differences that we see around the world. It doesn't seem to be exclusively income. Another thing we can look at is now splitting people between male and female. Overall, seems pretty consistent across all different regions where men and women seem somewhat equally likely to share meals with each other. There are some slight differences in the US that we can talk about later on, but overall, we don't see very large differences between men and women around the world. We do see bigger differences when it comes to age. So now here you're seeing sort of 4 bars for under 30-year-olds, 30 to 44, 45 to 59, and 60 plus. So younger people are at the top for each region, and then kind of it goes up in age as you go down. And I think what you can see kind of across all regions is that people increasingly share less meals with each other as they get older. So older adults all around the world are eating less with others than younger people. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in detail when it comes to the US, but I think overall this is true all around the world. So that's sort of just a brief overview on variation in rates of meal sharing around the world, just that there is very large variation. But should we care about this? Does this matter? What's the relationship between sharing meals and well-being? That's the next section I want to talk a little bit about. And what we see is this very positive relationship, that the more meals people share with each other, the higher their level of well-being. In this case, we're looking at a measure of life evaluation. This is the measure of well-being that Gallup asks in their surveys. It's one of the oldest questions that's been asked. It's kind of an interesting question. It's if you think of your life as a ladder between, the bottom rung is 0, the top rung is 10, on which rung of the ladder do you currently stand? And that question proves to be really predictive of all kinds of interesting outcomes, and as it turns out, also strongly related to meal sharing. So across countries, you see that sort of an increase with 1 extra meal per week is associated with an increase of 0.2 points on a scale from 0 to 10. What do we really mean by that? How can we actually think about how large that is? Well, if we look just at the difference between sharing no meals, now we're seeing the number of shared meals per week. If you go from no meals to just 1 more shared meal per week, that difference is about half as large as the difference between employed and unemployed adults. This is one of the biggest gaps that we see in well-being around the world, particularly in high-income countries. The well-being penalties of unemployment are enormous. And as it turns out, just even moving from no meal shared to 1 meal shared is about half as large as that gap. In general, life satisfaction, you can probably tell already, life evaluation, these levels tend to be pretty stable. You really don't see very large variation across different groups of people or across different countries. But here, we do see this kind of increasing relationship. The more meals you share, the higher your level of life evaluation, except sort of all the way at the top there. So for some people who are sharing every single meal with others, then we start to see a little bit of a decline. Again, not entirely sure what explains this. My sense is that, or actually, I don't know what my sense is. I don't really know what explains that. I could imagine that it has to do with some degree of income, some level of choice, where you live. Maybe some people want to share less meals. My own personal takeaway is that being with others is important, but alone time is a little bit important as well. But really, we don't really know. So here now you're seeing kind of similar graphs with the number of shared meals on the x-axis, and then these different measures of well-being. So life evaluations, again, how do you feel about your life overall? Positive affect, those are sort of positive moods and emotions, happiness and so forth. And then negative affect would be sort of stress, sadness, negative emotions. And again, overall, across both men and women, you see that more meals shared generally is predictive of higher levels of well-being, greater life evaluation, higher levels of happiness and positive affect, and lower levels of negative affect. The sort of steepness of the lines, you can see that for negative affect for women here, that red line is a little bit steeper than the line for men, which shows that sharing meals is more closely tied to negative emotions for women than it is for men. But I think that's a relatively small difference. And what we do see is that the strongest relationship is for positive affect. So sharing meals appears to be most strongly related to positive emotions, how you feel on a day-to-day basis. In other words, sharing very few meals is very predictive that you have low levels of positive emotions, and sharing more meals is predictive of higher levels of positive emotions. Here we see sort of similar things, but now we're looking at ages. So now we're looking at young people compared to old people. A lot of interesting things going on. I mean, I think one is that younger people report lower levels of life evaluation, but higher levels of positive affect. So in other words, younger people seem to be kind of less satisfied with their lives overall, but happier on a day-to-day basis. That's often why we measure these things differently, because it is not always the case that happy people are satisfied with their lives, or people who are satisfied with their lives are happy on a day-to-day basis. And you see this kind of interesting difference. I'm doing some other research now looking at the variability of emotions from day to day. And as it turns out, younger people are much more variable in their emotions than older people. If you ask a young person on one day, how happy are you? They could say 10. The next day they say 2. The day after that they say 4. You ask someone sort of above 40 or 50, 5, 6, 4 tends to be a little bit more stable. I think you're seeing something similar going on here. But overall, the number of shared meals does seem to be similarly predictive of higher levels of well-being across different ages, but maybe especially so for young people. Right? If you look at the steepness of these lines again for life evaluation for positive affect, younger people, the line is much steeper. The difference in well-being between young people who share meals and who don't is much greater than the difference for older people. And that's also going to become pretty important later on. So now what we're doing, you might imagine, okay, but there's a lot of other things going on with meal sharing, right? We looked at income, maybe different age levels of societies could explain these differences. Maybe there's different gender compositions, different education levels across countries. Maybe that explains the differences in meal sharing that we're seeing. So here, these are results of regressions where we're controlling for a lot of that. So I don't have to go into too much detail, but basically, we're now controlling for different countries, different incomes, different household sizes, gender, age, education, employment, and sort of financial security, and seeing can we still find a difference in well-being, even after controlling for all of that, between people who share more meals and who don't. And that's true, as you can see, kind of across countries. What this shows is that people who share more meals have higher levels of life evaluation than those who don't, even controlling for all kinds of social and demographic characteristics. So there's real differences, though, between different regions. And again, it's sort of hard to explain. You might imagine, well, in regions where people share a lot of meals with each other, not sharing meals might be particularly bad. Don't know if that's entirely true, right? It seems like the strongest relationship is in North America and New Zealand and Australia, that which is sort of in the middle of the pack, if you remember, of overall levels of meal sharing. It's very strong for South Asia, but not for East Asia. So there are differences between regions, We don't really know how to explain them, but again, I think the overall takeaway is that meal sharing is really important for life evaluations, even after accounting for a lot of different other variables. And we see similar relationships when it comes to positive affect. Again, some really interesting differences across regions. Now in East Asia is one of the strongest links that we see between sharing meals and emotions and happiness, whereas before, for life evaluations, it was sort of all the way at the bottom here. So hard to explain. We do see real differences, and again, for negative affect. Another analysis that we wanted to run, and this was kind of like the most shocking, I think, to me when I first saw this, is to what extent does meal sharing actually explain differences in well-being around the world? So like another way of asking that question is, as a socioeconomic indicator, just how useful is meal sharing relative to other social and economic indicators? So here, we're looking at the extent to which each of these variables can explain differences in life evaluation around the world. And income definitely matters. Being unemployed definitely matters. If we can sort of background this with how much money and time and energy and effort countries and individuals focusing on income, focusing on unemployment, they do matter for explaining differences in life evaluations. But sharing meals is actually either just as strong, if not an even stronger indicator of people's life evaluations than income or unemployment. Another way of saying that is if I want to know how satisfied you are with your life overall, it is at least as important for me to know how many meals you shared with somebody in the last week as it is for me to know how much money you make. And it's more informative than if I know if you even have a job or not. When it comes to positive affect, this is again sort of day-to-day positive emotions and moods, it's the most important. So if I want to know how happy you were yesterday, the first question I should ask is how many meals did you eat with somebody in the last week, not how much money do you make, and not whether or not you are unemployed. For negative affect, we do see that income and unemployment matter a lot. But again, sort of sharing meals and even dining alone to a certain extent are comparable in their explanatory power. So I think this is also just like a really important call to action, that this is something that we should be focusing on as researchers, academics, business leaders, policymakers, that just how important this is as an indicator. And again, I should say that a lot of this, or pretty much all of this that I'm showing, is not necessarily causal, right? So I'm not able to say that sharing meals causes increases in happiness, or that happiness causes you to be more likely to share meals. In all likelihood, it's both, and I think that's like absolutely a question where we need to hone in on moving forward. But just as an indicator in and of itself, as an indicator of people's well-being, especially given how comparable it is over time, over countries, I think this is a really, really important call to action to focus on it. So now we've looked at data all around the world from 2022 and 2023, seeing that there are really big differences in meal sharing around the world and that these differences are really closely related to well-being. But we haven't been able to look at the evolution of meal sharing over time. And for that, we don't have data all around the world for it, but we do have data in the United States. And again, that's coming from the American Time Use Survey. So again, roughly a sample of 12,000 people every year are asked what they're doing in the previous day. And then some of those respondents are also asked to report how they feel while doing those activities. And so what we can do is from 2003 to 2023, we can look at how often do people report sharing a meal with somebody in the previous day. And can we see any changes? Again, here now we're focusing on meal sharing and dining alone in the previous day, not in the previous week. And we're going to focus on dining alone. So this is the percent of respondents who report sharing all of their meals alone in the previous day. And this was actually the part of the project that I kind of was mostly in charge of. Some of my colleagues, Andrew and Alberto, did a lot of the data analysis for what I've just showed you. I was the one who sort of started digging into the American Time Use Survey data. And I had been wanting to look at this data for a really long time, and I heard my colleagues were working on this chapter. Really good excuse to try to look at it. And I remember I was taking the Amtrak from Harvard to New York, from Boston to New York, trying to do some data analysis. And if you're doing data analysis, you spend like the first week just cleaning the data, and like it takes forever, and it's really boring, and you're coding variables, and nothing's really happening. And then you have to like produce the first graph, and it's always a mess. And the graph either just it doesn't work, or it shows you something you didn't expect, and then you have to go back and recode all the variables and everything. So I did that with this, and it was finally time to produce the first graph. And the very first graph that I produced was this. What you're seeing here are years on the bottom, and then the percent of Americans who report eating all of their meals alone in the previous day over time. I think you'll agree that's a pretty clear trend line. There has been just a stark increase in the percent of all meals eaten alone in the previous day just in the last 20 years. In the most recent year, we were doing this analysis in 2023. That's an increase of more than 50% just 20 years ago. And so I saw this graph. It was the first graph that came up. And I thought, I blew it. I did something wrong. There's no way. There's no trend looks like that. That can't be true. So I tried to remeasure this, rejigger this in a few different ways, look at different measures of meal sharing. So instead of the number of meals shared the previous day, I looked at the percent dining alone, including time spent on food preparation, so maybe cooking, things like that. You see a similar upward trend in dining alone. And I thought, okay, well, maybe you can measure this in a different way. The percent of time while dining, just time alone while dining, you see a similar trend. And now if we also include time spent on food preparation, a similar trend. I'm relatively confident that there's something real going on here, that I think it's pretty clear in, again, one of the most reliable time use data sets in the world that we're seeing really stark increases in dining alone. And so what explains them? Again, we don't really know. But there are a couple of things that I think might be going on. So one is that there seems to be some importance of dining with people in your household versus people outside your household. So one thing we can look at is the percent of people living alone in the United States has also been similarly increasing. More people are likely to live alone today than they were in the past. It has significantly increased over time. Also, the difference in dining alone between people who live alone and people who live with others is dramatic. As you might expect, more than half of people who live alone are reporting eating all of their meals in the previous day. You see that spike during COVID there relative to people who live with others. But you can see sort of like, the trend lines are kind of increasing, though, for both groups. Even people who are living with others, you can sort of see an increase in dining alone over time. Another thing to look at is dining alone specifically among married adults. So here you're seeing 3 lines for dining alone overall, the percent of respondents who report dining with their spouse, and then dining with others. If you look at the spouse line here, that's actually kind of remained constant or even increased. So the percent of married adults who are eating with their spouse today is pretty comparable with 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago. What has changed is dining with others. So you see this line here that married adults are increasingly unlikely to report eating meals with people who are not their spouse over time, and that seems to be accounting for the increase in dining alone among married adults. You see something similar when you look at parents. So now here you're seeing 3 lines for dining with others, dining with children, or dining alone. Again, you do see some sort of increases overall in dining alone among parents, but when it comes to dining with their children, parents today seem just as likely to eat with their children as they did 5, 10, 20 years ago, but they are less likely to eat with others. There seems to be something going on where people are increasingly less likely to share meals with those outside their household who are not in their immediate family. More recently, quality of the graph's not great, but more recently, the rise of working alone is also important to look at. So here you're seeing people who do work remotely are compared to people who don't work remotely. You see similar increases in both groups, although you're starting to see, this is from just after COVID, right, that people who work from home after COVID are starting to report eating more meals alone more often. That might be something to pay attention to, but overall the trends are pretty comparable. Even still, so now, I won't go into too much detail on this, but now again we're trying to control for all of this. So we're trying to look at dining alone over time. To what extent can it be explained by these different control variables? So what these dots are showing are coefficients from different regressions where we're controlling for different things. What it really means is, so that the black dots are just the overall rise in dining alone over time. Then the gray squares there, we're controlling for working from home. You see basically no difference. Then the blue lines now we're controlling for household size. And you do see a drop. What that shows is that actually household size, living alone, increases in living alone can explain a certain amount of increases in dining alone. And then we add a whole bunch of other control variables, race, marital status, income, et cetera. Also, we see that it can explain some, but still not a lot. So even after controlling for changes in household size and composition, race, gender, changes in income, all of this, there's still a pretty large and significant increase in dining alone that's left unexplained. And I think, again, this is an important call to arms to try to figure out what is actually going on here, because I do think that this really does matter. So again, now we can just look across men and women. You see similar increases in dining alone for both men and women, although men are more likely to dine alone in the United States than women. You see similar results now. We're looking at different age groups, kind of increases in dining alone across all age groups overall. Older people are, again, more likely to dine alone than younger people. Older people are represented by, I think this is over 65s, are more likely to dine alone than younger people, which are 18 to 24, the black line here. But still increasing for both groups. However, it's been increasing particularly among younger people. So now we've normalized all of the rates of dining alone to their 2003 levels and just looking at what's the change across different age groups. And as you can see, these 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds, we see the largest increases in dining alone relative to other groups. And pretty stark rises. Rates of dining alone for 18 to 34-year-olds have increased by about 180% just in the last 20 years. So still, overall, I think it's important to keep in mind that they're still more likely to share meals or less likely to dine alone than older people, but that gap is narrowing. And given what we've already talked about already, I think that has some pretty important implications for well-being. Should we be worried about this? I think my answer is yes, right? I mean, if you look at differences in, this is now overall life satisfaction between Americans who dine with others and Americans who dine alone, you see pretty large gaps all across the board, right? So overall, men, women, different age groups, all across the board, people who share more meals are more likely to be more satisfied with their lives than people who don't. And again, these differences are really large and almost as large as the difference between employed and unemployed adults. Again, if you think about how often you see headlines in the newspaper about unemployment levels, have you ever seen a headline in the newspaper about sharing meals levels? I think we might want to start. This is a regression table. I won't spend really any time talking about it other than to say that here again we're controlling for a lot of differences across groups and still find large and significant differences in overall life evaluations for people who dine alone and people who don't. And we see similar differences now when it comes to affect, right? So now not just how you feel about your life overall, but happiness, tiredness, stress, pain, and sadness. And again, you see these gaps between people who dine with others and people who dine alone. And these are, again, remaining significant, except for tiredness, but remain significant even after controlling for a host of social and demographic variables. So just in the remaining time I have left, I want to take a quick pass through the relationship between sharing meals and other measures of social connections. This is sort of preliminary work. So here now we're linking this data from the Gallup World Poll with additional data set collected 10 years ago in 2012, a little bit more, on the Global Preferences Survey, which captured a lot of different measures of social connectedness and trust and reciprocity and altruism. I think the overall takeaway is that meal sharing, this is showing the correlation between meal sharing and these other variables of social capital. And you see that it's kind of strongly related to some, but not to all. You see sort of similar results when it comes to dining alone. So now we're also showing correlations. You see, well, people who dine alone are much less likely to say they would return favors. But sorry, I don't mean people. I actually mean countries. So this correlation is across different countries. It's pretty high level. There's not a lot of countries. That's why you see these big error bars. I think this is also kind of a rich opportunity for future research. What we do know is that when it comes to loneliness and social support, loneliness being how often people feel lonely, social support being the extent to which people feel like they have others they can count on in times of need, there we see sort of much more strong and clear relationships where people who share very few meals are much more say that they're lonely than people who share more meals. And we see the reverse relationship for social support. where people who share no meals are much less likely to say that they have somebody to count on, they have social support, than people who share more meals. So overall, I think there's 5 key takeaways from all the data and graphs that I just threw at you today. I think the first is that there are stark differences in rates of meal sharing around the world, differences that are very observable, very significant, but also pretty hard to explain. That sharing meals is an exceptionally strong indicator of subjective well-being, comparable to income, comparable to unemployment. That there have been large increases in dining alone in the United States, and particularly among young people. And meal sharing is closely related to some, but not all, measures of social connectedness. And finally, though, I think there remain large gaps in our understanding of meal sharing, in particular the causal dynamics of meal sharing. So at the beginning, I said social relationships and well-being, there's sort of a virtuous circle that goes on, where happier people are more likely to be more socially connected. Social connections lead to higher levels of happiness. We think there's probably something similar going on with meal sharing, where happier people are more likely to share meals, but also sharing meals is more likely to make people happy. We'll test that after the dinner tonight. But no, seriously, I actually do want to run an experiment sort of similar to that, because there aren't really that many that I know about, to sort of get at these causal dynamics. Which direction is strongest? Is it just happy people being more likely to share meals, or the other way around? Regardless, I hope to have convinced you that sharing meals is a really important indicator of well-being, and one that's worth paying attention to in the years to come. Thanks.
Okay, well, we begin the Q&A. Maybe anybody who wants to share a meal after, if you would pass your slips to the edge here, I'll gather them up. Yes, and we'd love to kick off a question and answer. Anyone in the room that has a question?
Right, two. One's going to drive me crazy on the graph. There was that flip in 2011.
Yeah.
Explain why.
No. So the question was, there was a blip in 2011. Can I explain it? No. Have I looked into it? Yes. I don't really know. At first we think maybe it has something to do with the financial crash, or the sort of long-term effects of that. Then we thought maybe there was something having to do with the survey construction. I think that's probably my best bet, is just for whatever kind of reasons that are hard to ascertain. The sample in 2011 was slightly different from the sample in other years. There is that little bit of a spike, but I think my guess is it's more noise than signal. But yeah, I unfortunately don't know the answer to that. It drives me crazy too. If you have any ideas, let me know, because it's bothered me as well, yeah. Yeah, so the question was, why am I interested in it? Well, so my interest, in a few different directions. Most of my research focuses on well-being and happiness. That's kind of what I try to study. I like to say that I do economics, but instead of focusing on income, I focus on happiness. And you really don't have to spend too much time in that field before you realize that social connections are just one of the strongest indicators. And then this topic of sharing meals, the measure of sharing meals in particular is a really interesting indicator of social connections, and therefore I also think a really interesting indicator of well-being, precisely because it is so objective and comparable over time, over people. How many meals you shared with somebody yesterday or in the previous week is really objective, and therefore really easy to compare. But also personally, I'm interested in what kinds of public policies or initiatives that governments or businesses can try to do to improve people's well-being. Sharing meals is a relatively easy one as far as it goes. In terms of the public policy tools that are on offer, economic growth, increasing income, lowering unemployment, or getting people to eat one more meal with someone else next week, seems like that could be a potentially really cost-effective way of improving well-being. So that's also why I'm interested in it. Yeah.
So I worked in the residential my question probably about that. What role institutions play that offer food as a component of an experience, and if there's that correlation with well-being in others.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, so the question was sort of like, what can institutions do related to the research to try to promote meal sharing? Yeah.
Uh, the, you know, our public school system and our school systems are set up to have like meal shares this day, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious how that plays into this.
Well, yes, how I think it plays into the country comparison, we do see sort of overall younger people are much more likely to share meals with each other than older people, which I do think is probably a function of something sort of like that, that younger people are spending their time at school, at university, workplaces, and so they're more likely to have shared meals. I mean, a simple answer to what institutions or policymakers is try to facilitate more meal sharing. So, I mean, in addition to doing this PhD, I work a little bit for the Happiness Research Institute in Copenhagen. And when I started working there, every day, everybody stopped work at 11:30 and went downstairs and had lunch together. And this annoyed me to no end at first. I would like be in the middle of something, like, no, come on, you guys go. I'm not even hungry. Like, I'll meet you down. Like, just bring me something back. And I quickly learned that was not cool. No, we were going to stop work. We were going to go downstairs. We were going to share a meal together. And of course, as it turns out, that was like one of the most important parts of the day, not just because it was an enjoyable experience, but also I think like for the sake of the company. If you feel more bonded to people at your company, you have different conversations with them when you're sharing a meal than you do at your desk. Really, really mattered. So I think sort of overall looking for opportunities to try to facilitate more shared meals would be a really important way to go about it. And also, I think kind of, maybe at a higher level, if you're sort of advocating to policymakers, like citing, I think, some of this research as well, that it's not just, this isn't just like a fun thing to do. It's not just taking away from work. Like this is actually really important for people's health, for people's well-being, and something that should be prioritized. One other thing I just want to say, maybe less common as a recommendation, but there is a lot of happiness research by Dan Gilbert in particular, who I showed at the very beginning of this, showing that our expectations often do not align with reality. So a lot of times if you think, well, I don't want to be bothered, like I don't want to go share a meal with somebody, I don't really feel like it. Actually, as it turns out, that might be much better for your happiness, might make your day much more than you thought it would. There's been a lot of interesting experiments on this of like randomizing baristas who speak to some customers but not others, or when you get onto the bus, you have to say hi to the bus driver or not. And a lot of these studies show actually really positive effects of social interactions. Even if you ask people in advance, do you want to? How happy do you think it'll make you? Like, no, it'll make me miserable, it'll make me super stressed. So I think even then, even if it seems like there's a barrier you don't necessarily want to, or people aren't really that willing to, that doesn't necessarily mean when it comes to social connections that it's not something worth pursuing. Yeah.
Great. I completely love the work that you're doing. I was curious, the last thing you brought up was the question of causality. And so what are your plans in terms of how to answer that question? Because this seems like a really difficult thing unless you're able to maybe follow groups of people and see that their meal sharing increases first, and there's some lag, and then happiness follows, right? So what are your thoughts on how to assess causality?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. So I think, yeah, you can run, the overall way of doing it is to try to run some experiment where basically you randomize some people to share meals with others and not others, and then you take their well-being, you survey them beforehand, and then you survey them afterwards, and then compare the two. I think there are a lot of kind of ways of doing that, some at smaller scales, some at larger scales. So I've been in contact with some community organizations in Vermont that do sort of community meals, and they have a sign-up sheet where people sign up to join a community meal. So what you could do is put some people on a wait list to have a community meal next month, and then other people randomized to have a community meal next week, survey everybody in advance, then track their well-being over time. I've been working on an app to do that as well. So if anyone sees any opportunities to use it, that could be a way of doing it, and then compare the two. I have sort of broader aspirations. If anybody knows anybody working at like a food delivery service, like Uber Eats or something like that, where you could kind of like randomize meal sharing vouchers at a really, really large scale, and give some people like discounts if they share a meal with a friend and take a picture of it, or people who don't. And then you can compare kind of well-being levels. Again, if you survey people before or after, can compare the two. I have been trying to get in touch with anyone at Uber Eats. They're not responding to my emails, but if somebody knows somebody, then reach out to me. That would be very cool. So yeah, I think that there's actually kind of a lot of different ways of running these experiments, small experiments, large-scale experiments, to get at that. And again, my sense is that it is probably bidirectional, right? I think that it is more likely that happier people, people who are in better moods, are more likely to go out and share meals with other people, but also the reverse might be true. And so running these types of randomized controlled experiments, I think, can help to get at the magnitude of that causal effect.
We have a table reserved at Annenberg for the group who is able to join. So that is Tracy, Lydia, Taylor, Alyssa, Mandy, Jays, and Michelle. You didn't get me your slip. We still handle a couple more people. I'll meet you out at the table here, and we'll all walk over together and get settled in at Annenberg.
Thank you. Thanks so much.